that I need to make. What did I say? One fellowship? Well, that's close. I have one announcement I need to make, and it's about a fellowship. The men's fellowship and coffee on March 22nd, when the ladies are meeting to have their retreat. As Joe said, we're meeting to have an advancement. So the men's fellowship and coffee will be at Scott and Amy Crow's house, March 22nd, 2025. And the address is here. It's 1874 CR 323. There's one out there on the bulletin board. You can get the address and type it into your little whatchamacallit and get there with no problem. That is in Carbon. And if you get lost, their phone number's on here. So keep that in mind, guys. Who in here never procrastinates? You're honest. I think that's something that we all do. There's sometimes I'll put off putting things off, especially things I don't really want to do, like cleaning up my shop, or something that's just busy work. I put those things off. We're going to talk tonight about that, really, but it's a little different. We're going to talk about seize the day. In the movie Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, his character often quoted this Latin phrase, carpe diem, seize the day. And I really like that. In fact, that's Bible. And we'll look at that in a few minutes, because there's a passage in the Old Testament that almost says the exact same thing. It says it a little differently. You know, we're going to look at this. A friend of mine had a motto, and I just remembered it just now. He had this motto, and it was something like this: never do today what you can put off to tomorrow. And I have thought about that a lot because I tend to be that way. But tonight we're going to talk about, turn to Judges 4. Judges chapter 4. We're going to talk about Deborah and Barak. Deborah was a judge in Israel. The Bible said that she sat under the palms and carried out her judicial activities. Verse 1 of chapter 4 starts in a very familiar fashion. And this is exactly what it says. And the children of Israel sinned again. This had been a habit with Israel. For a generation, they would be faithful. Then the next generation, they would sin. Well, now it cycled around to that generation of sin. Deborah was the reigning judge, and also a prophetess. And the Lord came to her and said, tell Barak to go to Zebulun and Naphtali to get 10,000 men and go into battle against Sisera. Sisera was a warrior for Jabin. He had iron chariots, which would be like our tanks. And he had a great number of those iron chariots. And so it would have been something that probably my friend Barak would dread terribly. But you see, look at verse 14 of Judges 4. Then Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. There's a translation. I don't remember what translation it was. I was looking at when I studied this. But it said, in this passage where it says up, it says it's a day for action. A day for action. In other words, get up. We got things to do. You ever hear your dad say that when you were younger? Get up, we got things to do. Or your mom. Deborah says, get up, we've got things to do. We've got to get into action. In other words, it's time. It's the day. Now, when she originally had approached Barak about going into battle against Sisera, Barak hesitated. In fact, Barak said, I'll do it if you will. If you will go with me, we'll do it. It almost seems like Barak was trusting in the faith of Deborah. But for some reason, he wouldn't have done it without Deborah. So Deborah goes with him. And so when that day comes, she tells him, okay, this is the day for action. You know, every day when we get up in the mornings is a day for action. It's a day to get something accomplished, especially the spiritual things in our life. The things that needs to be done, we need to accomplish it, not put it off. You know, when they went up against Sisera, I want to finish the story. When they went up against Sisera, they became, I'm talking about the armies of Sisera, became somewhat confused. Whether it was the attack or whether God caused it, they were confused. And so the armies of Israel, Naphtali and Zebulun, defeated them quite soundly, I might add. Now, you know where Sisera was when all this was going on? He jumped out of his chariot and he ran. All the way to the tent of Jael, who is the wife of one of his cohorts, one of his friends, one of his allies. She came to Jael seeking her protection, hiding behind her skirt, basically. Well, she brought him in, and of course he was tired from the fight and from running. You know, most bullies are cowards. You know that? Well, he definitely was. And so he goes into the tent, lies on blankets. She covers him up, and she said, stand at the door and watch. And if any man comes by, you tell him I'm not here. Tell him there's no man in the tent. And he said, now I'm thirsty. So she brought him some milk. But that's not all she brought. She brought a hammer and a tent peg. And while he lay sleeping, she took the tent peg in his temple. Now here's the PG-13 part. Drove it all the way through and fastened his head to the ground. Should I say that was the end of Sisera and his army? And, of course, next chapter, Deborah sings a song extolling her praises because of what she was willing to do. That she had turned actually against Sisera and Jabin's armies. You see, she sees the day. She did what they couldn't do, what the armies of Barak couldn't do, because the guy ran. So she finished it. You know, it's amazing to me. Deborah told Barak that if I go with you, it'll not be you that gets the credit for this battle. It'll be a woman. You know, I used to think that was her. I used to think it was Deborah that he was talking about. I'm not so sure now. Maybe he's talking about Jael. Because she made the difference. She took out Sisera. But this is what I want to do. I want to talk about seizing the day, or making this every day a day of action. One of the worst things to do is to put something off, because it snowballs. Have you ever noticed that? You put something off and it begins to snowball. It begins to get bigger and bigger. It gets harder and harder. How many things is there that you intended to do that you just didn't get done? Because it almost got out of your reach. There was a fellow, a young man. He took care of his father's sheep. His brothers were in battle. They were fighting the Philistines. There was one fellow for the Philistines that caused fear in the camp of Israel. You know the story I'm talking about now, don't you? That fellow's name was Goliath. He was one of the giants. Goliath had 4 brothers. David came to bring some food items to his brothers from his dad. And here this giant comes out taunting the armies of God. And they pull back into retreat form. David shamed them. His brothers called him naughty. Go back home to your dad, Go take care of those sheep. That's what you should be doing. But you know, David seized the day. He took advantage of the situation. Got a sling, got one rock, and I won't go into all the stuff beforehand, go into Saul and all that. He took a sling and a rock. He had 4 or 5 in case his brothers turned on him. And he walked out there and confronted that 9-foot monster. Now think about this for a minute. We're talking about a life and death situation. We're not talking about just a mild injury. We're talking about death at the hands of this monster of a man. And yet he faced him and then challenged the giant. And of course, you know the rest of the story. That rock that he had found its mark in the forehead of the giant, and down he went, dead. And then the armies of God seized the day. Off of the courage of this young man, David, they advanced and went after and chased and put to death the Philistines they could catch. Just because that one little shepherd boy seized the day, they won the battle. There was a queen. She must have been a beautiful lady. The king was Ahasuerus. Esther was chosen from a number of ladies to be the queen, following Vashti. Haman had great disdain for the Jews because they didn't respect him, he didn't think. It wasn't anything personal. They just didn't respect him because of God. He made himself to be something that he was not. And you know the story. He made a plan in which all the Jews would be killed. And Esther was reminded by Mordecai that she was a Jew. Turn to Esther 4, verse 13. Esther 4, verse 13. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" There are so many lessons in that passage, it's not even funny. The courage, the faith. But notice what Mordecai says. If you don't do it, somebody will. If you don't take control of this situation, somebody will. And your house will perish. Now, Mordecai is asking her to do something in which she could lose her life. You see, not even the queen could go before the king without an invitation. And she had not invited, or he had not invited her for 30 days. So if he approached her, or if she approached him, and he was angry, or in a bad mood, or just tired of her, all he would have to do is take that scepter, point it, and with a smooth move, have her put to death. Especially with the message that she was about to deliver about this edict that had come down from him. As you know, the rest of the story basically was she did approach later, after the day of the banquet. I'd love to talk about Haman, but I don't have time. After the day of the banquet, she went before the king. You know, that'd been something some people would have put off. Well, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait till a little bit later, till maybe he feels better, till he gets a full stomach. Maybe he gets some wine in him or whatever, and he's kind of relaxed, and then I'm going to go in there. She didn't. She went straight in and approached the king. Can you imagine what she felt like waiting for that scepter to be either pointed at her or her be allowed in? And she was allowed in. And so he visited with the king and told the king what was taking place. She seized the moment. She seized the day. As a result of that, the Jews were spared. Haman would lose his life and be hung on the same gallows that was built for Mordecai. Esther seized the day. The next person I want to give as our example, again, these are stories we've heard since we were young, but I appreciate some things about this that I really haven't brought up much in the past, and that was the way that they seized the moment. And they used it for God's glory, not necessarily their own, because it could have brought their death. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're three young Jewish men. They're in Babylon, or under Nebuchadnezzar. And the edict come down from the king that when there was music played, that they were to throw themselves down and bow to the large icon built in memorial or in the likeness of Nebuchadnezzar. Anyone who wasn't willing to bend down was put to death. The day come when the idol was erected And the music played. And all of Babylon went to their knees, except for three: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, right then would have been a good time to bow down and tie your shoes or fasten your sandals. Or to pick up a dime, throw it down on there. To do something so that they wouldn't notice you standing there. But they seized the day. They took advantage of that moment. They wasn't ashamed of their God, and they wanted them to know it. And they stood there. While the rest of Babylon was bowing before this idol, they stood, and they stood tall. And of course, as the rest of that story is, that the king was furious, turned the furnace up 7 times hotter than normal, and threw these young men in it. It was so hot that the guards were actually burned up that threw the boys in it. But one of the things that has always been interesting to me is when they looked in, there was 4 standing there, not 3. One like the Son of Man. Somebody was with them. It was somebody from God, and that somebody was God's Son. And then comes a young man by the name of Daniel. His enemies, the enemies of Daniel, those that were Medes and Persians, could not find anything against Daniel. You know, which when I read this, I thought about that. I thought about me. If my enemies were trying to find something against me, could they find something against me? I mean, something that would go against my character or my faith. How does the world see me? How does God see me when no one is looking? Can God find fault with me? The Bible says they couldn't find fault with Daniel. They couldn't find anything to use against Daniel, except for one thing, that he was a prayed man. Wow, how evil is that? They knew the only way they could capture Daniel is if the king would write an edict about praying to their gods of their people. When it came time for Daniel to pray, the Bible said he opened the windows. Was he afraid of being seen? He didn't have to open the windows. Nobody would have seen him if he not opened the windows. But he opened the windows. And he prayed. And of course, you know the rest of that story. He ended up there in the den of lions with a big, great stone rolled over the door. Interesting things happened that night. The king couldn't sleep. Daniel made a new friend, the lions. They left him alone. Now, I understand that these lions that they would use, they would keep food from them so that they would be hungry and quickly maul whoever was down in that pit with them. But they didn't. And the king was very happy and excited about bringing Daniel out alive. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting, the Medes and Persians, the Persian kings, when they made an edict, not even the king could break it. You know, he couldn't just say, well, okay, I'm changing this edict. He couldn't. He didn't have the power to do it. Once he put his seal on it, it was a done deal, and that's the way it's going to be. Even the king couldn't change it. Thus, Daniel had to be thrown in there. I love what the king said. And the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? What does that say about Daniel right there, that little verse? The living God that you serve continually. Every day was a day of service. Every day was a day that Daniel served his God. Peter and John, Acts 4 verse 10. You talking about seizing the day. These guys were in trouble. They had been preaching Jesus, the kingdom. This is something new. They were having good response as a result of their preaching. 3,000 had already responded there in Acts 2. And every time they preached, they was getting a great response. The Jews got angry, jealous, began to come up with all kinds of complaints against Peter and John and the others. And so they called them into a court. And I love what they say. Acts 4 verse 10, let it be known to you all and to all the people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man stands here before you whole. This isn't us that did it. We didn't work this miracle on this lame man. God did. His Son did. His Son whom you crucified. Acts 4 verse 19, after they began to wail against Peter and John, they said, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. They're saying, you got to stop this. You can't preach anymore of this man's name in Jerusalem. He said, you be the judge of that. But as far as we're concerned, we cannot help but speak the things which we have seen and heard. Can't help it. You got to live with it. You got to deal with it. You got to deal with it the way you want to. It's up to you. Because we're not going to stop. And you can't stop us. Hebrews 11:32 through 34 talks about faith. What we've talked about tonight and what we've seen tonight is men and women of faith. And their faith was broadcasted. It wasn't kept hidden. So in the great museum of faith in the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11, some of them are mentioned. And what more shall I say, for the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, and Samson, and Jephthah, also of David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. And those aliens there are not from Mars. They're the enemies of Israel. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Ordinary men doing what faith does. They seized the day. John 9 verse 4, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. You see, Jesus said that there's going to come a time whenever my work is done. I can't do anything more. So the work I have to do today. Do you have intentions, things that spiritually you have wanted to do or needed to do, and you keep putting it off? Don't. The graveyard is full of procrastinators. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 2, for he says, in an acceptable time I have heard you, and the day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the acceptable time. Now, today, right now, is the day of salvation. When we talk about seizing the day, we're talking about seizing your faith. James 2 verse 14, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, do you put that off? Now I added that. And one of you says to them, depart in peace and be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for their body. What does that profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead faith. But someone will say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without your works. I'll show you my faith by my works. You see, faith is seizing the day. Faith is action. It is doing and saying what God wants us to say and do. We have to seize our courage. 2 Timothy 1 verse 12. It took courage for David to do what he did. It took courage for Esther to do what she did. It took courage for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, Peter, and John to do what they did. It took courage. They had to swallow their fear and go do that which they dreaded. 2 Timothy 1 verse 12, for this reason I suffer these things, nevertheless I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. God is able to keep that which I've committed to him. And my last point, and the rest is yours, is about example. It's about following one another. Two working together, like Barak and Deborah. They made each other stronger. Barak wouldn't go to war without Deborah and her faith. Sometimes we need to rely on our friends. Sometimes our friends need to be able to rely upon us. Now, when I say friends, I mean members of the body of Christ. Listen to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken. I love this passage, because it tells me how important it is for me to support my brethren and for my brethren to support me. There is strength in numbers. That's what the Bible is saying. There's strength in the church. All we have to do is call upon one another, and the strength is there. Tonight, I'd encourage you to seize the day, to get ready for a day of action. Not put off the things that you know you need to do. Let's say you need to be a Christian, but you keep putting it off. No, don't put it off. Today is the day of salvation, not tomorrow. Tomorrow is really not on my calendar. There may be a day, but we don't know that it will happen. So if that's what you need to do, then we need to make that decision tonight. If you need to make a decision to be stronger in your faith and to be more active in the kingdom, then tonight is a good opportunity to make that commitment. And you may not have to come forward to do this, just where you're sitting, or when you go home at night in the quiet of the evening. Redirect your life. Redirect your direction. Seize the day. But if you have a decision that you need to make tonight, if we can help you, let us help you while we stand and sing together.
Oh, listen to our wondrous story, counted once among the